Hello students, this video is about the evidence of evolution. So we can call evolution a scientific theory, and that term means that it's supported by many different pieces of evidence. It doesn't have the same uncertainty that we use with the word theory in everyday life. So instead, today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the many pieces of evidence that support the concept of evolution. Quickly, let's review what evolution is. So we can define it as the change in inherited characteristics of populations over time. Let's break that down. Change has to do with the allele frequency shifts. We're talking about genetics here. The allele frequency shifts between generations that occur when evolution is occurring. Populations. So individuals cannot evolve, and they cannot change their DNA to match their environment. Instead, if populations are changing over time, that is evolution. Finally, that idea of time. So there's different time scales that evolution can happen at. It can happen in just a few generations, or the species diversity that we see today has really taken billions of years. Natural selection is the driving force for evolution. Those that are better adapted to their environment, we call that more biologically fit, they're the ones that survive and produce offspring. There's a couple ideas that have to exist in order for natural selection to be able to work. First, the idea of variation. There has to be differences within a population. Then there has to be competition, some sort of struggle. We also can call that selection pressure. And there has to be heredity. It has to be only genetic traits that are able to be passed from parents to offspring that can evolve in this way. There's a lot of examples of natural selection where we see certain individuals selected for and other individuals selected against. For example, this is a really famous example with moths, and it occurred during the Industrial Revolution in London. So we originally had these two different variations of the moth, a light moth and a dark moth. So we call those the different variants or different morphs of this species. Originally, the trees in that area were kind of light in their bark, and so we can see that this light one sort of blends in a little bit better than this darker one. In this environment, this darker one would be selected against because it would be easier to catch if you're a bird to eat it up. Then after the Industrial Revolution, there was so much pollution in the air that there was a change in the environment. And the trees themselves were staying sort of this dark color. And on this dark tree, we can see the light moths are much easier to see than the dark moths. Therefore, the light moths would be selected against. When there was this change in the environment, then over time, there was also a change in the number of the different types of moths in that population. So we could say something like this occurred. Over moth generations, the number of light moths went down, the number of dark moths went up. Assuming these things are controlled by alleles, then we have an increase in the dark moth allele, and we have a decrease in the light moth, or the alleles that control that. This is evolution. So our first big piece of evidence for evolution is we can see it happening. And there's many different pieces of evidence where we can see evolution occurring. One place we talk about a lot with evolution occurring now is with antibiotic resistance, which is generally a bad thing for us humans. So this is supposed to represent different bacteria. And down here at the bottom, there's sort of a key to the variation. And the level of resistance to antibiotics. So very low resistance to the sort of yellow ones, they basically die when there's antibiotics there, and we go up to very high resistance to antibiotics. So with our original bacteria population, see how there's variation, there's differences, and there are a couple pieces or a couple bacteria that are already resistant to the antibiotic. And so if you use antibiotics, then all of the ones that have low resistance are going to die out, but the ones that are left, those very few, those ones now have this whole open space where they can continue to reproduce, and they're going to multiply, and we have a population that becomes resistant to antibiotics. The reason that this is so important with bacteria is because a lot of these antibiotic resistance can occur in plasmids. And if you think back to our bacteria, like quote-unquote reproduction, most bacteria just divide and make more of themselves, but they can go through a process of conjugation. They go through conjugation, they're sharing plasmids. And so if antibiotic resistance occurs in a plasmid, then that plasmid can be shared between a lot of different bacteria very quickly. The other place we can start to see evolution occurring a lot is with artificial selection. So artificial selection is when human choice acts as the driver of evolution. Dogs are a great place to look at this. So we started with a gray wolf as the ancestor of all dogs, and then different dogs were selected for, and over time we end up with incredible diversity of dogs. So over here there are some super adorable dogs. This one up here is my girl Bailey, and this one back here is Jamie. They lived together for a while. Jamie is like 170 pounds. He is this giant lab. He's super sweet, he's super slow. He's been bred for very different things than my little dog has. So it's sort of hard to tell from this picture because she's in the front, but she only weighs about 45 pounds. And so we see this incredible difference in dogs. That is due to human choice as the artificial driver of evolution. But it still allows us to see evolution in action. All of that's evidence of evolution because we see it happening. We can see it in a lot of different places. The other place we see a ton of artificial selection is with domestication of all sorts of things. So domestication of crops is a really great example. We have, ancestral corn or maize was very small, didn't have a lot of nutrients, was not very sweet, but if you choose the very biggest from that generation and plant that one, and the biggest from the next generation over and over again, we end up with corn that's a lot more like the corn that we have today. Okay, next big piece of evidence that evolution has occurred has to do with the geographic distribution of living species. So we generally see that populations that are closer together are more similar than those that are far apart, even if they have similar environments. That indicates that a common ancestor may contribute to how closely related organisms are. Here's a couple different examples around the world. That idea of a common ancestor is something that I'll come back to a million times. I just want to define it. Common ancestor is the most recent population from which all organisms in a group are directly descended. So it could be a recent common ancestor, like that between modern elephants and woolly mammoths, which are now extinct, or it could be really far back in time. Like this is an image that shows all life, and at one point all life shared a common ancestor, and so it can work all the way backwards to that. When we're talking about ancestors, we're talking about things that were shared in the past. It's sort of like a family tree, right? So it's not that your great-grandfather turns into your grandfather, turns into your father. That doesn't represent a family tree well. Instead, it would be more like this. You and your siblings have a common ancestor, which is your parents. You and your cousins have a common ancestor, which is your grandparents. This image right here is the beginning of a cladogram that shows relationships between groups and has to do with time. I see this all the time. When we're looking at evolution, there's always this image of like it turns from this to this to this to this. That's not really the case at all. Instead, these things that are alive today share a common ancestor, and just looking at when they share the common ancestor tells us a little bit about the relationships. Here's another place we can see that. If we're looking at like a fly and an ant right here, we can trace these lines back to where those lines meet, and that's the most recent common ancestor. I hear this so often with evolution. People always want to tell me that humans came from monkeys, and the answer to that is really no. Evolution would not say that. Modern evolutionary theory would not agree with that. Instead, modern humans and great apes share a more recent common ancestor than others. So an image like this is a better representation of evolution than an image like this, to me at least. Third piece of evidence evolution has occurred has to do with homologous body structures. So homologous means that they came from a common ancestor. So if there's a common form but really different functions, that's evidence that it's because a common ancestor existed. Like a human and a horse. If we look at their forearms, they're very similar in structure, but we use them for very different things. So they wouldn't have evolved to be similar unless they came from a common ancestor and then changed over time. Vestigial structures are another example of that. Vestigial just means anything that was used in the past, and there's remnants still today, but they're no longer used in the modern species. For example, whales. Modern whales have a little bit of a pelvis left, and the pelvis is used for walking on 4 legs. They don't walk on 4 legs, but their ancestors did. And so that little vestigial structure is evidence of evolution. In humans, we've got a little tailbone that we don't use for anything. That's another piece of evidence that we shared a common ancestor with something that did have a tail. We can also see that in embryos. So embryos have to do with the development of things over time, and especially with mammals, if we look back at early development, there are so many similarities in the way that things develop. And so that's evidence that at some point they shared a common ancestor because there's so many similarities in the developmental process. fossil record is another piece of evidence. So this allows us to see that things literally have changed over time. We can watch it happen. We can see all of these different missing links over time. And then we can use this process called radiometric dating or radioactive dating to see how old fossils actually are. In order to really understand this, we need to keep in mind distribution in time and space, which just has to do with the fact that there's such a long amount of time that represents Earth, and Earth is so big. And so when we think about life that existed in the past, it is really different from today, and things change over time, and it allows all of these things to support the idea of evolution. Skip that for now. You guys are going to do more with radioactive dating, so I'm going to skip that in this right now. And instead, I'm going to end with this. One last piece of evidence for evolution that I want to talk about is something that's really occurring a lot more now. That's looking at DNA and RNA. So we can say that the more similar that things are, it's evidence that there was a common ancestor more recently in time. And so this cladogram, which we'll talk about more, that shows relationships between organisms, a lot of them now are made straight from DNA, or from amino acid sequences, or from really looking down at the molecular level that shows relationships between organisms. This is what I'm going to end with, and it has to do with that last idea. There was a big paper published in March of 2013 in Nature's Review of Genetics, and it had to do with this really kind of difficult to read but very interesting way that we look at evidence of evolution. So what they were looking at is looking at proteins, looking at DNA, looking at these different pieces, and connecting them back with the idea of evolution, and all these different things or different methods to do that. And I just wanted you to see the fact that this is still a type of work that's in progress. It's not like we are done finding new evidence of evolution. Instead, there's much more that we have to look at, but it keeps supporting this same central theory of evolution. Okay. So just to review very quickly, evolution is the change in populations over time. It occurs through natural selection, which requires variation, competition, and heredity. And there's lots of evidence for evolution, including, we can see it happen, geographic distribution of living species, homologous and vestigial structures, embryos, the fossil record, DNA and RNA, and a lot more. And even more things that are still being discovered today. So I hope that's helpful.